Chapter 13. Now almost a whole month has passed since I touched these notes of mine, which were begun under the influence of confused but intense impressions. The catastrophe which I felt to be approaching has actually come, but in a form 100 times more violent and startling than I had expected. It has all been something strange, grotesque, and even tragic, at least for me. Several things have happened to me that were almost miraculous. That is at least how I look upon them to this day, though from another point of view, particularly in the whirl of events in which I was involved at that time, they were only somewhat out of the common. But what is most marvelous to me is my attitude to all these events. To this day I cannot understand myself, and it has all floated by like a dream, even my passion. It was violent and sincere, but what has become of it now? It is true that sometimes the thought flashes through my brain, wasn't I out of my mind then, and wasn't I all that time somewhere in a madhouse, and perhaps I'm there now, so that was all my fancy, and still is my fancy. I put my notes together and read them over. Who knows, perhaps to convince myself that I did not write them in a madhouse. Now I am entirely alone. Autumn is coming on, and the leaves are turning yellow. I'm still in this dismal little town. Oh, how dismal the little German towns are! And instead of considering what to do next, I go on living under the influence of the sensations I have just passed through, under the influence of memories still fresh, under the influence of the whirl of events which caught me up and flung me aside again. At times I fancy that I am still caught up in that whirlwind, that storm is still raging, carrying me along with it, and again I lose sight of all order and measure, and I whirl round and round again. However, I may perhaps leave off whirling and settle down in a way, if, so far as I can, I put clearly before my mind all the incidents of the past month. I feel drawn to my pen again. Besides, I have sometimes nothing at all to do in the evenings. I am so hard up for something to do that, odd as it seems, I even take from the scurvy lending library here the novels of Paul de Kock, in a German translation, though I can't endure them. Yet I read them and wonder at myself. It is as though I were afraid of breaking the spell of the recent past by a serious book or any serious occupation. It is as though that grotesque dream, with all the impressions left by it, was so precious to me that I am afraid to let anything new touch upon it, for fear it should all vanish in smoke. Is it all so precious to me? Yes, of course it is precious. Perhaps I shall remember it for 40 years. And so I take up my writing again. I can give a brief account of it to some extent now. The impressions are not at all the same. In the first place, to finish with Granny. The following day she lost everything. It was what was bound to happen. When once anyone is started upon that road, it is like a man in a sledge flying down a snow mountain more and more swiftly. She played all day till 8 o'clock in the evening. I was not present and only know what happened from what I was told. Potapych was in attendance on her at the casino all day. Several Poles in succession guided Granny's operations in the course of the day. She began by dismissing the Pole whose hair she had pulled the day before, and taking on another, but he turned out almost worse. After dismissing the second and accepting again the first, who had never left her side, but had been squeezing himself in behind her chair and continually poking his head in during the whole period of his disgrace, she sank at last into complete despair. The second pole also refused to move away. One stationed himself on her right and the other on her left. They were abusing one another the whole time and quarreling over the stakes in the game, calling each other lajdak and other Polish civilities, making it up again, putting down money recklessly and playing at random. When they quarreled, they put the money down regardless of each other, one, for instance, on the red and the other on the black. It ended in their completely bewildering and overwhelming Granny, so that at last, almost in tears, she appealed to the old croupier, begging him to protect her and to send them away. They were, in fact, immediately turned out in spite of their outcries and protests. They both shouted out at once and tried to prove that Granny owed them something, that she had deceived them about something and had treated them basely and dishonorably. The luckless Potapych told me all this the same evening almost with tears, and complained that they stuffed their pockets with money, that he himself had seen them shamelessly steal and continually thrust the money in their pockets. One, for instance, would beg 5 Friedrich's door for his trouble and begin putting them down on the spot side by side with Granny's stakes. Granny won, but the man shouted that his stake was the winning one and that Granny's had lost. When they were dismissed, Potapych came forward and said that their pockets were full of gold. Granny at once bade the croupier to look into it, and, in spite of the outcries of the Poles, they cackled like 2 cocks caught in the hand, the police came forward and their pockets were immediately emptied for Granny's benefit. Granny enjoyed unmistakable prestige among the croupiers and the whole staff of the casino all that day, until she had lost everything. By degrees her fame spread all over the town. All the visitors at the watering place, of all nations, small and great, streamed to look on at une vieille comtesse rousse tombée en enfance, who had already lost some millions. But Granny gained very, very little by being rescued from the 2 Poles. They were at once replaced by a third, who spoke perfect pure Russian and was dressed like a gentleman, though he did look like a flunkey with a huge mustache and a sense of his own importance. He, too, laid himself at his lady's feet and kissed them, but behaved haughtily to those about him, was despotic over the play, in fact immediately behaved like Granny's master rather than her servant. Every minute, at every turn in the game, he turned to her and swore with awful oaths that he was himself a pan of good position, and that he wouldn't take a kopeck of Granny's money. He repeated this oath so many times that Granny was completely intimidated. But as this pan certainly seemed at first to improve her luck, Granny was not willing to abandon him on her own account. An hour later, the 2 Poles who had been turned out of the casino turned up behind Granny's chair again, and again proffered their services, if only to run errands for her. Potapych swore that the pan of good position winked at them and even put something in their hands. As Granny had no dinner and could not leave her chair, one of the Poles certainly was of use. He ran off at once to the dining room of the casino and brought her a cup of broth and afterwards some tea. They both ran about, however. But towards the end of the day, when it became evident to everyone that she would stake her last banknote, there were behind her chair as many as 6 Poles who had never been seen or heard of before. When Granny was playing her last coin, they not only ceased to obey her, but took no notice of her whatever, squeezed their way up to the table in front of her, snatched the money themselves, put down the stakes and made their own play, shouted and quarrelled, talked to the pan of good position as to one of themselves, while the pan of good position himself seemed almost oblivious of Granny's existence. Even when Granny, after losing everything, was returning after 8 o'clock to the hotel, 3 or 4 Poles ran at the sight of her bath chair, still unable to bring themselves to leave her. They kept shouting at the top of their voices, declaring in a hurried gabble that Granny had cheated them in some way and must give them something. They followed her in this way right up to the hotel, from which they were at last driven away with blows. By Potapych's reckoning, Granny had lost in all 90,000 roubles that day, apart from what she had lost the day before. All her notes, her exchequer bonds, all the shares she had with her, she had changed, one after another. I marveled how she could have stood those 7 or 8 hours sitting there in her chair and scarcely leaving the table. But Potapych told me that 3 or 4 times she had begun winning considerably, and, carried on by fresh hope, she could not tear herself away. But gamblers know how a man can sit for almost 24 hours at cards without looking to right or to left. Meanwhile, very critical events were taking place all that day at the hotel. In the morning, before 11 o'clock, when Granny was still at home, our people, that is, the General and de Greux, made up their minds to take the final step. Learning that Granny had given up all idea of setting off, but was going back to the casino, they went in full conclave, all but Polina, to talk things over with her finally and even openly. The General, trembling and with a sinking heart in view of the awful possibilities for himself, overdid it. After spending half an hour in prayers and entreaties and making a clean breast of everything, that is, of all his debts and even his passion for Mademoiselle Blanche, he quite lost his head. The General suddenly adopted a menacing tone, and even began shouting and stamping at Granny, cried that she was disgracing their name, had become a scandal to the whole town, and finally, "You are shaming the Russian name," cried the General, and he told her that the police would be called in. Granny finally drove him from her with a stick, an actual stick. The General and de Greux consulted once or twice that morning, and the question that agitated them was whether it were not possible in some way to bring in the police, on the plea that an unfortunate but venerable old lady, sinking into her dotage, was gambling away her whole fortune, and so on. Whether, in fact, it would be possible to put her under any sort of supervision or restraint. But de Greux only shrugged his shoulders and laughed in the General's face, as the latter pranced up and down his study talking excitedly. Finally, de Greux went off with a wave of his hand. In the evening we heard that he had left the hotel altogether, after having been in very earnest and mysterious confabulation with Mademoiselle Blanche. As for Mademoiselle Blanche, she had taken her measures early in the morning. She threw the General over completely, and would not even admit him to her presence. When the General ran to the casino in search of her and met her arm in arm with the Prince, neither she nor Madame de Comminges deigned to notice him. The Prince did not bow to him either. Mademoiselle Blanche spent that whole day hard at work upon the Prince, trying to force from him a definite declaration. But alas, she was cruelly deceived in her reckoning. This little catastrophe took place in the evening. It suddenly came out that he was as poor as a church mouse, and, what is more, was himself reckoning on borrowing from her on an IOU to try his luck at roulette. Blanche turned him out indignantly and locked herself up in her room. On the morning of that day I went to Mr. Astley. Or, to be more exact, I went in search of Mr. Astley, but could find him nowhere. He was not at home or in the park or in the casino. He was not dining at his hotel that day. It was past 4 o'clock when I suddenly saw him walking from the railway station towards the Hôtel d'Angleterre. He was in a hurry and was very much preoccupied, though it was hard to trace any anxiety or any perturbation whatever in his face. He held out his hand to me cordially with his habitual exclamation, "Ah!" but without stopping walked on with rather a rapid step. I attached myself to him, but he managed to answer me in such a way that I did not succeed in even asking him about anything. Moreover, I felt for some reason ashamed to begin speaking of Paulina. He did not ask a word about her. I told him about Granny. He listened attentively and seriously and shrugged his shoulders. "She will gamble away everything," I observed. "Oh, yes," he answered. "She went into play just as I was going away, and afterwards I learnt for a fact that she had lost everything. If there were time I would look in at the casino, for it is curious." "Where have you been?" I cried, wondering that I had not asked before. "I've been in Frankfurt." "On business?" "Yes, on business." Well, what more was there for me to ask? I did, however, continue walking beside him, but he suddenly turned into the Hôtel des Quatre Saisons, nodded to me, and vanished. As I walked home, I gradually realized that if I had talked to him for a couple of hours, I should have learnt absolutely nothing, because I had nothing to ask him. Yes, that was so, of course. I could not possibly formulate my question. All that day Paulina spent walking with the children and their nurse in the park, or sitting at home. She had for a long time past avoided the General, and scarcely spoke to him about anything serious at any rate. I had noticed that for a long time past. But knowing what a position the General was in today, I imagined that he could hardly pass her over. That is, there could not but be an important conversation about family affairs between them. When, however, I returned to the hotel after my conversation with Mr. Astley, I met Paulina with the children. There was an expression of the most unruffled calm on her face, as though she alone had remained untouched by the family tempest. She nodded in response to my bow. I returned home feeling quite malignant. I had, of course, avoided seeing her, and had seen nothing of her since the incident with the Burmer helms. There was some affectation and pose in this, but as time went on I felt more and more genuinely indignant. Even if she did not care for me in the least, she should not, I thought, have trampled on my feelings like that and have received my declarations so contemptuously. She knew that I really loved her. She admitted me, she allowed me to speak like that. It is true that it had begun rather strangely. Some time before, long ago in fact, 2 months before, I began to notice that she wanted to make me her friend, her confidant, and indeed was in a way testing me. But somehow this did not come off then. Instead of that, there remained the strange relations that existed between us. That is how it was I began to speak to her like that. But if my love repelled her, why did she not directly forbid me to speak of it? She did not forbid me. Indeed, she sometimes provoked me to talk of it, and of course she did this for fun. I know for certain. I noticed it unmistakably. It was agreeable to her to listen and to work me up to a state of misery, to wound me by some display of the utmost contempt and disregard. And, of course, she knew that I could not exist without her. It was 3 days since the affair with the Baron, and I could not endure our separation any longer. When I met her just now near the casino, my heart throbbed so that I turned pale. But she could not get on without me either. She needed me, and surely not as a buffoon, a clown. She had a secret, that was clear. Her conversation with Granny had stabbed my heart. Why, I had urged her 1,000 times to be open with me, and she knew that I was ready to give my life for her. But she had always put me off, almost with contempt, or had asked of me, instead of the sacrifice of my life, such pranks as the one with the Baron. Was not that enough to make one indignant? Could that Frenchman be all the world to her? And Mr. Astley? But at that point the position became utterly incomprehensible. And meanwhile, my God, what agonies I went through! On getting home, in an access of fury, I snatched up my pen and scribbled the following letter to her. Polina Alexandrovna, I see clearly that the denouement is at hand which will affect you also. I repeat for the last time, do you need my life or not? If I can be of use in any way whatever, dispose of me as you think fit, and I will meanwhile remain in my room and not go out at all. If you need me, write to me or send for me. I sealed up this note and sent it off by corridor attendant, instructing him to give it into her hands. I expected no answer, but 3 minutes later the attendant returned with the message that she sent her greetings. It was 6:30 when I was summoned to the General. He was in his study, dressed as though he were on the point of going out. His hat and coat were lying on the sofa. It seemed to me as I went in that he was standing in the middle of the room with his legs wide apart and his head hanging, talking aloud to himself. But as soon as he saw me, he rushed at me, almost crying out, so that I involuntarily stepped back and was almost running away. But he seized me by both hands and drew me to the sofa, sat down on the sofa himself, made me sit down in an armchair just opposite himself, and keeping tight hold of my hand, with trembling lips and with tears suddenly glistening on his eyelashes, began speaking in an imploring voice. "Alexey Ivanovitch, save me, spare me." It was a long while before I could understand. He kept talking and talking and talking, continually repeating, "Spare me, spare me." At last I guessed that he expected something in the way of advice from me. Or rather, abandoned by all in his misery and anxiety, he had thought of me and had sent for me, simply to talk and talk and talk to me. He was mad, or at any rate utterly distraught. He clasped his hands and was on the point of dropping on his knees before me to implore me, what do you suppose? To go at once to Mademoiselle Blanche and to beseech, to urge her to return to him and marry him. "Upon my word, General," I cried, "why, Mademoiselle Blanche is perhaps scarcely aware of my existence. What can I do?" But it was vain to protest. He didn't understand what was said to him. He fell to talking about Granny too, but with terrible incoherence. He was still harping on the idea of sending for the police. Among us, he began, suddenly boiling over with indignation. "Among us, in a well-ordered state, in fact, where there is a government in control of things, such old women would have been put under guardianship at once. Yes, my dear sir, yes," he went on, suddenly dropping into a scolding tone, jumping up from his chair and pacing about the room. "You may not be aware of the fact, honored sir," he said, addressing some imaginary honored sir in the corner. "So let me tell you, yes, among us such old women are kept in order. Yes, indeed. Oh, damn it all!" And he flung himself on the sofa again, and a minute later, almost sobbing, gasping for breath, hastened to tell me that Mademoiselle Blanche would not marry him because Granny had come instead of the telegram, and that now it was clear he would not come into the inheritance. He imagined that I knew nothing of this till then. I began to speak of de Greux. He waved his hand. "He has gone away. Everything of mine he has in pawn. I'm stripped of everything. That money you brought, that money, I don't know how much there is. I think 700 francs are left, and that's enough. That's all, and what's to come, I don't know. How will you pay your hotel bill?" I cried in alarm. "And afterwards, what will you do?" He looked at me pensively, but I fancy he did not understand and perhaps did not hear what I said. I tried to speak of Polina Alexandrovna, of the children. He hurriedly answered, Yes, but at once fell to talking of the prince again, saying that Blanche would go away with him now, and then what am I to do, Alexey Ivanovitch? He asked, addressing me suddenly. I vow, by God, I don't know what to do. Tell me, isn't this ingratitude? Finally he dissolved into floods of tears. There was no doing anything with such a man. It would be dangerous to leave him alone, too. Something might happen to him. I got rid of him somehow, but let nurse know she must look in upon him pretty frequently, and also spoke to the corridor attendant, a very sensible fellow. He, too, promised me to keep an eye on the general. I had hardly left the general when Potapych came to summon me to Granny. It was 8 o'clock, and she had only just come back from the casino after losing everything. I went to her. The old lady was sitting in an armchair, utterly worn out and evidently ill. Marfa was giving her a cup of tea and almost forcing her to drink it. And Granny's tone and voice were utterly changed. "Good day, Alexey Ivanovitch, my good sir," she said, bending her head slowly and with dignity. "Excuse me for troubling you once more. You must excuse an old woman. I have left everything behind there, my friend, nearly 100,000 roubles. You did well not to come with me yesterday. Now I have no money, not a farthing. I don't want to delay a moment. At 9:30 I'm setting off. I have sent to that Englishman of yours, what's his name, Astley. I want to ask him to lend me 3,000 francs for a week. So you must persuade him not to take it amiss and refuse. I am still fairly well off, my friend. I have still 3 villages and 2 houses, and there is still some money. I didn't bring it all with me. I tell you this that he may not feel any doubts. Ah, here he is. One can see he is a nice man." Mr. Astley had hastened to come at Granny's first summons. With no hesitation and without wasting words, he promptly counted out 3,000 francs for an IOU which Granny signed. When this business was settled, he made haste to take his leave and go away. "And now you can go too, Alexey Ivanovitch. I have only a little over an hour left. I want to lie down. My bones ache. Don't be hard on an old fool like me. Henceforward I won't blame young people for being flighty, and it would be a sin for me now to blame that luckless fellow, your general, either. I won't give him any money, though, as he wants me to, because, to my thinking, he is utterly silly. Only, old fool as I am, I've no more sense than he. Verily, God seeks out and punishes pride, even in old age. Well, good-bye. Martha, lift me up." I wanted to see Granny off, however. What's more, I was in a state of suspense. I kept expecting that in another minute something would happen. I could not sit quietly in my room. I went out into the corridor, even for a moment went for a saunter along the avenue. My letter to her had been clear and decisive, and the present catastrophe was, of course, a final one. I heard in the hotel that Degrue had left. If she rejected me as a friend, perhaps she would not reject me as a servant. I was necessary to her. I was of use to her, if only to run her errands. It was bound to be so. When the train was due to start, I ran to the station and saw Granny into the train. Her whole party were together in a special reserved compartment. "Thank you, my good friend, for your disinterested sympathy," she said at parting from me. "And tell Praskovia, in reference to what we were discussing yesterday, I shall expect her." I went home. Passing the General's rooms, I met the old nurse and inquired after the General. "Oh, he's all right, sir," she answered me dolefully. I went in, however, but stood still in positive amazement. Mademoiselle Blanche and the General were both laughing heartily. Madame de Comminges was sitting on the sofa close by. The General was evidently beside himself with delight. He was murmuring incoherently and going off into prolonged fits of nervous laughter, during which his face was puckered with innumerable wrinkles, and his eyes disappeared from sight. Afterwards I learnt from Blanche herself that, having dismissed the prince, and having heard how the General was weeping, she had taken it into her head to comfort him by going to see him for a minute. But the poor General did not know that at that time his fate was decided, and that Mademoiselle Blanche had already packed to set off for Paris by the first train next morning. Stopping in the doorway of the General's study, I changed my mind and went away unnoticed. Going up to my own room and opening the door, I suddenly noticed a figure in the half-darkness sitting on a chair in the corner by the window. She did not get up when I went in. I went up quickly, looked, and my heart stood still. It was Paulina.